Renaissance was a period in history where African Americans defined themselves creatively, in music and in literature. This outpouring of creativity was forged under the tremendous pressure of the racism that permeated the country during the early part of the 20th century. And just like precious metal, the artists of the Harlem Renaissance survived the pressure to leave a legacy that withstood the test of time.
Harlem Renaissance was a tremendously active period. I think Alan Locke captures it best in his book, and Alan Locke is such an interesting person himself, one of our first Rhodes Scholars, African-American Rhodes Scholars. But in his book, The New Negro, published in, I believe, 1925, he really explained what the Harlem Renaissance was about. It was a consciousness movement. It was black folks defining who they are and understanding their contributions as a people, their legacy, where I'm from, what I'm about, what makes me as an individual, as a group. And it is such a lively period of intellectual growth, to say the least. Some of my favorites of the period, of course, are Langston Hughes, and I often will cite his "The Negro Speaks of Rivers," his famous epic poem, which, in fact, black folks never call it that, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." That's the official title, but they always call it "I've Known Rivers," which is one of the stanzas in it, because it's such a powerful piece of I mean, he mentions Africa, he talks about the Euphrates and Egypt, and about the Mississippi and life and connectedness of rivers. It's a very consciousness poem. There's so much happening through those first 2-3 decades of the Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston, who's from Florida, and becomes such an epic writer of the period. One of my favorites of hers is "Let Them Breathe Thunder." She's written so many dust tracks of the is it Savannah, I guess, one of her many works, and in fact, Hurston was down here working as and up there as well, working as a maid at the same time when she was being published, which is fascinating. For black folks, you could always live in those two worlds. Out of necessity, you had to live in those two worlds. Others of the period, of course, as you move forward, individuals like Richard Wright. Now, some would say Richard Wright is part of the second Renaissance. They say more of the post-30s. I never get into that because, in my mind, the Great Depression and the hardships of the 30s did not stop the Harlem Renaissance. I see Richard Wright as a part of that, and his great works, Black Boy, Native Son. I mean, these are just just epic classics. Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, etc. And then you think of the works of Margaret Walker and her great poetry, and her great novel Jubilee. You could go on and on with the period, but what I think they all have in common, it might be summed up best by Claude McKay, who was from the West Indies, and again part of that Renaissance, in his poem, "If We Must Die." And that poem is a very defiant piece. It's a very feisty piece. He talks about, if we must die, let us nobly die. Not as some hogs pinned in an inglorious spot, but as men fighting back, etc. It's that kind of powerful assertiveness. Is I will be heard. I will assert my rights as a human being on this planet and in these United States of America. And for me, that captures the essence of the Renaissance. I mean, when I'm reading somebody like Claude McKay's character Jake in Home to Harlem, I mean, Jake to me is a he's what black life is about as well. It's not just those who are professionals who become your physicians and your lawyers, and yes, and Black America has those. But Jake is someone who hangs out at the bars. He drinks. You know, he talks about what's going on in the community. I still think that later on, somebody like Rudy Ray Moore, who becomes a well-known black comedian in the modern era, I think he had Jake in mind. And Langston Hughes would do something very similar in the characters he would develop. In fact, in a series he did in the Chicago Defender, he would have characters who very much acted out the innermost aspects of the black community, everyday life, right? And Hughes did this series called The Best of Simple, and his main character, Jesse B. Simple, or Just Be Simple. And Just Be Simple was this character who he had girlfriends, you know, he lived in a third-floor rear apartment, you know, that sort of thing. And he would be talking about the issues, particularly in his setting in New York. He talked about what Harlem was, and he talked about why he felt good and proud to be in Harlem. And again, you get this sense of, whether it's Harlem or whether it's Chicago, where you're getting these black enclaves and black folks being assertive and expressing themselves. You get a real sense of a race becoming a quote-unquote a race on its own terms. We understand who we are. We understand what this society is about. We understand what is done to us. We understand what we must do, whichever road we take, Boys, Garvey, Washington, whichever road we take, or Randolph, that we must take it with an understanding of what our collective past is. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about the Renaissance. And plus, you know, for many, they'll look at the Renaissance and rattle off the great writers, William Attaway, for example, Moses, Man on the Mountain. You know, there's so many great writers of the period. And in fact, I would go forward and include Leroy Jones, maybe Baraka, you know, into that group as well, or Nikki Giovanni. I put them all back into that. They're part of that legacy, part of that trying to define who we are. But sometimes too, we leave out the music aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance was an explosion in music as well, not just literature. The things we were doing in song and dance, in theater, etc. I mean, it's just incredible. I don't make a distinction or just cut out a particular period. I would include in the Renaissance people like from the Scott Joplins and Jelly Roll Mortons and all of those periods. You say, well, isn't that 1890, early part of 20th? That's all part of that. Because contrary to what some people will do, say one music form goes here and it ends, that was not happening in the black community. Ragtime was still around as the Harlem Renaissance was going on. Blues has always been with us. Gospel has always been with us. The band era is moving forward. We had all the syncopated sounds in New Orleans and Kansas City, now in New York. The black women blues singers are part of that Renaissance. And ironically, I mean, the heart and soul of that whole part of the Renaissance of the black women blues singers is not in New York early on, it's in Chicago. You know, when you think about the Ma Rainey's as they're coming up, the Bessie Smiths as they come up north, etc. And the list goes on and on. I mean, Chicago is the capital of that, with the whole race record industry, OK Records, Paramount Records, that literally makes the record industry in America. We tend to forget that. But the first great profits in the record industry were those race records aimed at a black audience that make this industry and are the backbones to these. You look today in LA and see Capitol Records, they ought to be singing praise to those early black artists. And even if they don't sing praise to the early ones, they could sing praise to Nat King Cole, who really made Capitol Records. But that's another story. That's another story But when you look at all of that, and these people are just not singing to be singing. If you start analyzing what's going on in the tunes, it's again expressionism. It's telling you about the people. For example, in those race records, you look at the ads of those race records. You look at the themes of those race records. Thousands of these race records. I mean, they're singing about everything imaginable. Tunes like High Yellow Mom, which they do hundreds of different versions of. What's going on there? They're telling you things about questions of color. They're telling you things about values we have or don't have, etc. Ain't got no job blues. Ain't got no job blues. And in fact, when Bessie Smith sings Ain't Got No Job Blues in 1929, black folks almost tore up a theater they were in listening to this. And people say, well, it was the rowdiness and so forth. That's really not it. The reality was it was 1929, the bottom falling out of the economy, and here's Bessie Smith on stage talking about Ain't Got No Job Blues. She really could pull on the heartstrings of those folks. So these things are happening in these tunes. People are expressing themselves, who we are. They're talking about, you know, our strengths. They're talking about our weaknesses, but it's being expressed. And so in a very profound way, it's not just the literature. The literature is crucial, but it's also in music. It's also in dance. It's also in the theater plays that are happening. As you know, we're trying to express ourselves there as well. So it's in the real sense a total expressive movement.
Writer Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die, became prophetic during this period. Because while the Harlem Renaissance is developing brilliant African-American art, many parts of the country are embroiled in racial disturbances. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, African Americans worked to build a utopian economic system, which came to an abrupt end during the historic riots of 1921.
After the Indians from the southeast were forcibly moved to Oklahoma territory, that was supposed to be their territory. So, the United States and the whites would stay out of it. That lasted as long as, until they found oil in Oklahoma. What had happened also is the Indians that moved to Oklahoma, had been moved from the southeast, they were called the civilized tribes. They had really adopted or adapted to Western culture. They had taken up American culture. Some of them had even owned slaves. When they went to Oklahoma, they were the most educated and most cultured people there. What the difference was, though, they held their land collectively as a tribe, not individually. When oil was discovered in Oklahoma, the Indians were in control of it, but what the government did, and many white entrepreneurs, they went to the individual Indians and had them sell off plots of land. That way, the oil companies could move in. The Indians lost their hold because they did not own land individually, they owned it collectively. Well, some of those Indians had slaves. Some of the slaves were given their freedom. Some of the Indians intermarried with blacks. And in Oklahoma, at that boom time, it was a time that you could go there and get jobs. So blacks who went to Tulsa, descendants of some of the Indians who had moved there, were probably the most prosperous community in Tulsa. They settled in Tulsa, and because of that oil money that they were still connected with, they were among the most educated people in the state, not just the city of Tulsa. So what they built was a separate black economy because of segregation. So there was a street, I think the area was known as Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. I think Greenwood was the main street. As a matter of fact, there's a entertainment group called the Gap Band that's from Tulsa, and the word Gap, G-A-P, stands for Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. They named themselves that because they wanted to keep that community's name from dying out. So when you hear the word Gap Band, it's a remembrance of that neighborhood, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine Street. Well, if you go there today, you will see the monument built in honor of Black Wall Street, and you'll see the businesses there. What made it significant was that money kept turning over in the community. So today, the problem in the black community is the money comes in and then it goes back out. We have very few banks and very few businesses that we can spend our money in. So it goes back out to Sears and you know, pennies and whatnot. But in Tulsa, you had black doctors, black lawyers, you had black banks, insurance companies, construction companies. The money kept turning over. So the black doctor put his money in the black bank, who lent money to the black homeowner, who then paid the black construction worker, who then bought his material from the black hardware store. So the money kept turning over. The whites in Tulsa were literally jealous when they found out what was happening there. They could not believe. And how dare these blacks be so prosperous when the rest of us whites are so poor. Plus the fact that the community was only a block or two from downtown. So it was sitting adjacent to downtown. Obviously that land was going to be able to appreciate. The riot started over an incident where supposedly a young black man attacked a young white woman, supposedly in a downtown elevator during the day. It's probably one of those fictional accounts. The black man was arrested. The young white woman later said she was never attacked or anything like that. The young black man was arrested. He was put in jail. A lynch mob formed. Blacks tried to defend him. And the pretext then of blacks defending this young black man, whites were then deputized by the local deputy and went into the black community to supposedly put down the uprising. And they used the pretext to destroy businesses, homes, churches, anything and everything that was in their way. They even bombed the area from an airport that was near Black Wall Street. About 2 or 3 miles beyond the neighborhood, there's an airport that sits up on a hill. And supposedly planes were taking off there and actually flying over the black area and dropping bombs. It is the only time, supposedly in American history, that American citizens have been bombed by other Americans. We'll never know how many people died from that. The numbers are in the hundreds. Some blacks left. Some blacks were killed. Some were buried in mass graves. They think some are thrown in the rivers that run through the area. We'll never know. What happened, though, was that afterward, they rebuilt it. The eventual downfall came with urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, I think. If you go through that area now, there's an interstate highway that runs right through where Black Wall Street used to be. Now they've put up some homes. There's a museum there. There's a branch campus, I think, of Oklahoma State University and Langston University. It's quite well kept, but there are no businesses there now. There's practically no businesses there. So the black community has been robbed of its economic base. So now if you want products, you have to go out of the community, or you spend your money with, you know, Walgreens, drugs, or one of the major chains. There are almost no black-owned businesses there. And historically, we're finding out now that even in the South, when black men were usually lynched, it wasn't over some transgression of a white woman many times. It was over their economic success. Wall Street, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the pretext was over this incident with the black woman. But they went from there, from attacking that one black man, to destroying a whole black neighborhood. The same thing in Rosewood, Florida. The whites were jealous of the economic success of the black community in Rosewood. So they used an incident to get involved in a white man, a black man and a white woman. To not only just attack that black man, but then to attack the community. And I think a few years ago, the state of Florida paid some of the survivors a reparation. But we're finding out now that much of the lynching that took place in the South was not the fact that they were accused of, black men were accused of some transgression against a white woman, that was usually a cover screen. But the real object was a successful black businessman. And so the idea of blacks, even during segregation, forming their own separate institutions, which they were told to do, if they got too successful, whites became jealous and many times would use some type of pretext to attack them and run them out of town. So that way then the blacks would have to then spend their money with the white store owner. And so they would be still economically dependent upon whites. What has been amazing is how the records have been virtually eliminated. When researchers finally began to put two and two together and go back and try to look at the records, they were gone. The newspaper accounts from the local Tulsa paper for those 2 days are missing. They've been destroyed. Much of what we get about the Tulsa riot was from eyewitness accounts. And the fact that it happened because one of the agencies that came in was the Red Cross. They left some records of the devastation. It was a 36 square block area that was destroyed, I mean, virtually destroyed. That much black business. You know, you don't usually think of Tulsa as, you know, an area that you would find a successful black community, but this is probably one of the most successful black communities at the time, probably outside New York and Chicago. And it demonstrated that essentially, in one sense, they were too successful. That local white Tulsans just could not fathom a black community being that successful. So it raises the question about when even Southern segregationists say, well, you know, we don't care how close or how high you get is how close you get. No, they were jealous of black economic success. They wanted to keep blacks economically dependent upon white institutions, whether it was during slavery or after slavery. They didn't want blacks to be too successful. And I think that has some implications even for today.
Skies for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. Amen.